If you want to be more effective in your work and in your life, and you'd like to have more confidence that you're meeting your intentions, this is where it begins. Welcome to Do Busy Right, helping you organize your information and manage your attention so that they work for you, not against you. We educate you and encourage you by discussing ways to be more effective, not more exhausted. Let's do busy right. This episode is part of a series on the lies of productivity. When I say lie, I mean a fundamental misunderstanding about the nature of what we're doing and how to best approach it. But these things are pushed at us so hard, and the challenges we face are so severe and growing that it feels like we're moving further and further away from what our situation actually should be. So I call them lies. In each of these episodes, I'll state a common belief about our work or our productivity, and then talk about the facts of why it just ain't so. A common quote attributed to Mark Twain, in error, probably, is, "It's not what you don't know that kills you, it's what you know for sure that just ain't so." So this series is an attempt to move through those misunderstandings. So once I've talked about what the common belief is, I'll talk about a more realistic mindset. And in most cases, practical steps to address the situation from that new mindset. So here we go. Let's start breaking down the lies. This lie is odd in that it's less about us being told something that's not true than it is about the lack of discussion around a topic that needs discussion. So a lie out of silence. I'll tell you what it is, and then I'll organize that thinking a little bit more. So the lie here is that somehow it's simply human nature that we understand how to be productive, that we just somehow are born with an instinct towards selecting our most important work, that we're somehow driven to do the work. And there's lots of fringe conversations going on around this big hole in what everybody's talking about. That hole has a lot to do with an understanding of how people work. And when I say how people work, I mean how people do work. What's the best way to do work? That's kind of this lie that I want to think about. So if you think about somebody coming up and you asking a question about, well, how do I do X? And they go, well, you should just know how to do that. Everybody knows how to do that. And apply that to managing our own work. Then that's this lie of omission that I'm talking about. So we'll get into it in more detail. We'll talk about what the problem is, what it is that we don't understand. We'll talk about symptoms of our lack of understanding. We'll talk about what a new mindset might look like, what happens after we kind of transform our thinking, a transformed mindset. We'll talk about the results of having that new mindset and maintaining that new mindset. And then we'll talk about some tools that you may want to acquire that will help you when you've achieved that new mindset to get the results that you're looking for. The lie, what I'm calling the lie, is that it's human nature that we just understand how we should work. And this comes up in various different formats. But at the end of the day, it's primarily the fact that nobody wants to talk about this. It's almost as if we were just to assume that every human being knows how to do math. And so we don't teach it in school. We don't talk about it. And if it comes up that we actually get the courage to ask somebody about it and say, well, it turns out I don't know how to do this, we get funny looks because there's this cultural assumption that we're just supposed to know how to do this thing. I contend that we don't. There are several reasons, I think, why we don't understand. And there are several problems in our lack of understanding. Because of this big hole in our understanding and in our conversation and in our training, we simply struggle to be as productive as we could be. So again, it's not a lie of commission, but a lie of omission. Probably felt this. It's like I said, if you don't know math and you go ask somebody and they look at you funny, Maybe even more relevant is if you don't know how to use some fairly common technology and you have to go to somebody and say, well, I don't know how to do that. Their expression shows that they clearly believe that you were behind the door when this knowledge got handed out. The challenge is amplified by the fact that we face knowledge work. Most of us are knowledge workers, and that knowledge work is a relatively new phenomenon. Therefore, the vast majority of people don't know how to manage knowledge work for themselves or for others. Schools even haven't learned to teach us that we need to have this set of skills. It's the modern day equivalent of knowing how to read or knowing how to write, is being able to deal with these huge sets of information that we're confronted with every day. So since knowledge work is new, then we have some new tactics, and I covered this in a previous episode. When work was manual, it could be observed and people could say, hey, you're not doing that right. But now that it's unobservable, knowledge work is unobservable because it happens inside of our skulls, it's very difficult for people to approach us and go, oh, you know what? You're not holding that right. And if you held it this way, it'd probably be better. We work with our own computers at our own desk in our own cube, and people don't observe how we use the tools of a computer. They don't observe how we use our email client, for example. Another skill that I think is useful and getting increasingly useful is the ability to touch type. And I've reported in other places that I had this conversation with my team of programmers over whether or not learning to increase their touch typing speed would improve their productivity as programmers. And I got the cold shoulder, to put it mildly. Several of my people were at least mildly offended that I would even bring a subject like that up and even begin to ask them, what is your typing speed? They thought it was none of my business and was not part of the job description. Many of the tools that we use fall into the same black hole of conversation and learning, and our knowledge work and our productivity practices are part of that. At the end of the day, you have a human brain, and its behavior, its habits, and its biases either support or defeat your ability to make your brain do what you want it to do. And again, when we talk about knowledge work, we understand how to clap our hands or snap our fingers. And if we don't, then we kind of learn it on our own. We learn how to whistle. We learn how to use our bodies in observable ways. And other people can help us observe that. But our mental processes are really not like that. Thus, we have a hard time even discussing it. We have a hard time even comparing our skill set to somebody else's because, again, it's not observable. You see this in problem solving. If somebody solves an interesting problem and you go to them and you say, well, how did you go about solving that problem? They're likely to say, well, the solution just came to me. If they're fairly introspective, they may get into a conversation about loading up the problem and letting it percolate, let their subconscious work on it, some of these kinds of stories. But most people can't even describe how they do their knowledge work. They do what seems right to them, and they presume then that that's as productive as human beings know how to be. But again, we go back to, we have a deep understanding of how brains work. And if we can use that understanding to support our productivity, to support behaviors that make us tend to do work rather than make us tend to procrastinate work, then it'll be a very powerful tool and help us move our productivity along in ways that support our knowledge work rather than defeat our ability to do it well. We go through these clear principles of how human brains work, and then we apply that thinking about thinking, that meta thinking, to problems that knowledge workers face, and we come up with some significant tactics around how to manage our own work and about how to manage our own attention, and thus about how to be more productive in the work. I was at least partially trained as an engineer. An underlying engineering principle that we were taught is the following. Every system is ideally designed to produce the results you observe, or designed or constructed, set up So every system is ideally set up to produce the results you observe. And what this means is the system works. It just may not produce the results you want. Instead, you use a system, it produces the results you observe, and those may or may not be the results that you want. But the statement reminds us that we need to go back and look at the system. So if a machine continues to produce faulty parts, we need to go look at the machine and see if it's what it's actually doing, rather than just presuming that the machine is working in the only way it can. Engineers are very comfortable with this idea, and systems thinkers and people who do projects are very comfortable with these ideas. And if they're not getting the results that they want, then they'll go back and they'll look into the system. They'll tinker with it. Problem solvers are the same way. They'll do something that seems right, and then they'll test to see if it works. Programmers often work this way. They'll take a guess at a sequence of coded statements that they think are likely to produce the output that they're looking for, and then they'll see if it does or doesn't against some test data. If it doesn't produce the results that they're looking for, then they can go back to specific statements in that coded procedure, and they can say, oh, this didn't work the way I thought it was gonna, the way I imagined it would, so let me change it out for something that works in a different way. Or let me take the output of that part of the process and modify it before it gets to the next step of the process. And that'll solve these problems. Well, fine, Larry. Esoteric engineering principles aside, how does that work in our productivity? I bring it up so that I can say that you have a system, and that system is ideally set up to produce the results you observe. It's not some moral failing. It's not some inability to make your brain work. It's just that the system behaves in the way the system behaves and produces the results that it produces. So when we don't get the output that we're looking for, we need to go back and look at the system. So thinking about your system of productivity and your system of work management, if your highest level productivity tool is a to-do list, and the result of you using that to-do list is that you don't get the right things done, or you feel stress over time, or you're wasting a lot of time generating the to-do list itself, then it's time to go back and look at the system and not just automatically default to some moral, emotional, psychological failure on your part. Oh, those things do exist. They're the most unlikely problem. In medical diagnosis, the maxim is, if you hear hoofbeats, think horses, not zebras, which keeps doctors from doing what lay people do and coming up with, I got a tickle in my throat, so I must have bubonic plague or whatever. Instead, look at the most common set of problems first and see if those might be applicable to your situation. And so in the same way, if we're not getting the productivity results that we want, we need to go back and look at our productivity system rather than just assuming that we're somehow deficient. That causes a little bit of an extended problem, along with the fact that there's a vacuum of conversation about how work, works, and about how our brains process and deal with knowledge work. Since there's not a clear understanding of the horses versus the zebras, so to speak, then we go for these esoteric solutions, these weirdness things, I'm just not capable of behaving in these ways, so I'll just have to limp along like I can. And that prevents us from going back and looking at the system itself. That's kind of a big, mushy problem statement for us. But at the end of the day, I think it boils down to the simple fact that our culture has not learned yet to talk about this problem, to research it effectively using scientific methods, and then to propose complete solutions. Instead, we have tips and tricks, lore and legend, and hints and allegations about how to do this better. That's the problem statement. There's no reason to expect that you should just be born with the ability to understand how to be productive. I think the new mindset, and we'll get to this in more detail later, is to be open to the fact that there are people out there, and I claim to be one of them, who have thought deeply about engineering a solution to this set of problems that we have. And that solution is based on the principles of understanding knowledge work and some understanding of how our brains work, and marrying those two subjects together to come up with a complete system that helps you get better at your work. And when we say get better at your work, we're talking about the analogy of a professional tennis player is to an athlete as a lawyer is to solid knowledge work. There's a set of underlying principles that we can get better at that then are magnified by our technical knowledge and our understanding, our theoretical and scholastic understanding of our subject matter. Well, how do you know if you have a problem? Well, I would say most people have it. Again, when you hear hoofbeats, think horses, not zebras. So I would say most people simply don't understand, and we'll talk about why, simply don't understand these principles. And that's why I do what I do, is I want people to understand these principles, to utilize these tools, and thus get better, more productive with less stress. We'll run through a list of some symptoms and we'll talk about what those things are. A common symptom is you're consistently feeling this nagging sense of, well, there's got to be a better way, or, does it have to be this confusing and stressful? And by this, I mean work. Our work is challenging. Our work is difficult in a lot of cases, but that doesn't mean it should be hard to do in the same way that theoretical physics is hard to do. We're creating a PowerPoint presentation. We're building a speech to give to people. This knowledge work, we're transforming one set of information into another set of information. In some ways, the more we do that, the smoother we should be at it and the easier it should become. Much like you'll know that I'm fairly new to recording these podcasts, and there are different tools, and I don't yet know what the best way to put those tools together is in order to have a seamless effort into giving this conversation. At the end of the day, however, all I'm actually doing is talking. So what about that is hard or mentally challenging or frustrating, if you will? So if you're constantly feeling this nagging sense of, wow, this shouldn't be this hard, then you're probably right. And again, let's go back and look at the system rather than just thinking of yourself as, well, I'm just some sort of a wimp, or I'm an imposter, or all these things that we toss around in the common culture today to describe why we feel the way that we feel. So that's one symptom. Another symptom is you spend a ton of time and mental energy trying to understand various systems of productivity. If you spend a ton of time doing that, then what you're doing is you're actually researching solutions to the problem. The problem is, how do we as humans get more productive at knowledge work? If you're spending a ton of time and mental energy trying to do that, then what you're actually doing is not your job, but you're doing, dare I say, my job. So I'm spending time thinking about these things and engineering a solution, while you should be out there being a lawyer, a doctor, architect, all of these knowledge work professions. And so I guess what I'm saying, it actually boils down to, if you have a job, then you need to be focused on that, and you don't have the excess time and energy to also be a solutions engineer. There are solutions that we've put into place, and so learning about that solution may be a much better way for you to spend your time, as compared to constantly picking up a new tool and trying to implement and learn that and build habits around it, or constantly reading tips and tricks and trying to figure out, well, where does this tip apply as compared to that tip, and when do I implement these things? Using tips and tricks to build a system is like walking into a warehouse of parts and randomly trying to cobble together a machine that works. So you have to back up and understand the underlying processes. And I've spent a decade studying this problem, learning more about the psychology of work, and then bringing those two fields together to think about this. But the symptom 2 is really perhaps an outgrowth of symptom 1. And I mean, you feel like there's got to be a better way. So you go in search of that better way. And I would just say, well, don't spend a ton of time doing it. Just spend some time listening to these conversations, and that may give you additional leverage towards a solution and not distract you as much from your full-time job. A third symptom is that you feel like you adopt a new system and it feels like it doesn't fit you somehow. So you wind up trying to pick and choose components to cobble together from different systems. Actually, you've never been given a good definition of what a system should be able to do for you. And by that, I mean, you implement a system and something about it feels off or feels hard. That's probably you having to change a work habit more than it is that you're some unique shaped human brain in ways that mean this system doesn't work for you. Oh, I see it working for other people, but my brain is different and it just doesn't work for me. Well, again, think horses, not zebras. You have a human brain. 98.6% of the ways we think, feel, and behave are described by fundamental principles that apply to just about every human being. So before you worry too much about your own unique differences that are a fraction of the problem, think more about when you adopt a new system, you're facing the challenges that any human faces in learning and in building habits. And that's why it feels uncomfortable, not because it has to be perfectly tailored to you and match your individual fingerprint ridges, but because your brain has learned habits of doing things in certain ways and trying to do them in different ways, trying to build new habits and new workflows is challenging to our brains. So we covered 3 symptoms, and I'll go back and recap this more briefly, but I did want to talk about the 4th symptom is a big one. You adopt a new methodology, a new system, a new tool, and there's this constant draw back to the tactics that other people are using. And by that, I mean, the baseline stuff, to-do list, managing from your email inbox, multitasking. It's actually a symptom if you are constantly drawn back to these things, because what that means is that you haven't found a solution. Instead of finding a solution, committing to it, and building those habits, you constantly fall back into these old patterns of behavior. The real challenge is to recognize the Dave Ramsey saying that I constantly go back to, and that is, if you do what you see other people doing, you'll be just as broke as they are. And if you know Dave Ramsey, he talks about financial things, financial matters. And so he uses the word broke in a financial sense. But I think that applies in a lot of cases, particularly in our productivity practices. If you do what you see other people doing, then you'll be just as stressed, just as much behind, and just as frantic as they are. A subset of the 4th symptom is that you may even be slightly embarrassed to bring these topics up. And I guess money management, now that I think of it, is a pretty good parallel. We're not actually, many of us are not actually taught how to budget, how to use a checkbook, if you still use a checkbook, how to think about this important function in our lives. And so we look around and we see, okay, well, what does everybody else do? And we start trying to do that. Well, those are people that wind up with huge piles of debt. Those are people that wind up calling the 800 number on the TV screen about debt relief. Those are the people that wind up with these huge challenges. And that's Ramsey's point, is the principles are actually quite straightforward. And what we need to do is worry more about doing the principles than reinventing them. That's the 4th symptom. The 5th is this fairly common, consistent switching, jumping from one system to another. what's happening is, and again, this relates back to the fit thing that we talked about in symptom 3. Adopting any new workflow takes time to build the habits of thought, to build the habits of practice, to build the habits of memory of how this system works. A strong symptom is if you're flipping from system to system to system, and you're picking up the bullet journal, and then you're saying, no, what I need is a Pomodoro timer. No, what I need is more mindfulness practice, and constantly flitting around these things. My electric bass teacher teaches that if you go looking at YouTube videos to learn a system of how to play the electric bass, then you're not going to be as successful as if you follow a structured system that takes longer than 7 minutes in YouTube to explain. A lot of people, when they pick up an instrument nowadays, they go look at YouTube videos and they see some guy shredding on the electric bass or the flute or whatever it is, and they try and emulate that. What my bass teacher claims is that you've got to have this underlying technique, and he teaches how to do that. It's not sexy, it's not quick, but if you learn that first, then you're well set up for the rest of these exotic behaviors that we see people being able to accomplish. So that's similar, kind of sticking to a system long enough to let the workflow habits build. So we'll rehash the symptoms real quickly. 1, you've got this nagging sense there's got to be a better way. 2, you spend a ton of time and energy trying to study various systems and trying to theoretically see if they apply to you. But you already have a full-time job. You don't have time to do this intensive research. New systems, number 3, new systems feel like they just don't fit you. But that's the mismatch of new habits against old habits, and not the mismatch of your uniqueness conflicting with the general principles. 4 is you fall back to the least common denominator tactics, to-do list, managing from email, multitasking. If you do that consistently, then that's a symptom of this problem. And 5 is you don't stick to systems long enough for habits to build and take hold. And so you're never actually using the system properly, so it never produces the actual results. As an example, I tell people that adopting the attention compass takes 8 weeks. The coaching model is 8 one-hour meetings, 1 a week for 8 weeks. And the reason that coaching model is successful is because between each hourly meeting, you have 7 days to make a habit become more real in your life. And I'm going to hold you accountable. If you were to come to me for coaching, and in week 1, I say, okay, well, this week I want you to explore using your mobile device as a capture mechanism. Well, you know that I'm going to ask you about that when we get back together. And so you actually take the time to build these behaviors. We've talked about the problem. We've talked about the symptoms. Now let's talk a little bit about this transformed mindset. And I'm sure I've telegraphed what I'm about to tell you. The transformed mindset is to become a student again of this stuff, not a researcher. You don't have time to research it and put it together from the ground up, but a student of this stuff. You move away from tips and tricks. You move away from 5 to 7 minute YouTube videos, and you move towards a coaching experience that's going to support you as you try and change your behaviors. It's going to teach you about a unified system that incorporates actual knowledge of how brains work and actual experience with people trying to implement new processes with knowledge about how brains work. If you can adopt that mindset of, I'm a student, I don't know how to do this. I don't know because I've got this problem. And the problem, of course, being the one that we talked about originally. The problem is nobody's teaching this stuff. Therefore, most people are trying to learn it on their own and build it from the ground up. Well, the transformed mindset is to believe that there is a set of knowledge out there, and you'd be more effective spending your time learning that set of knowledge from an expert than cobbling together pieces on your own. I am something of a do-it-yourselfer in my house. I have done many projects, and some of them I've completed successfully. Others have just been beyond my skill level. There's wisdom in knowing which is which. And so if you're trying to create a system from scratch, just recognize that while it may not be beyond your skill level, it's probably beyond your ability to devote time to. Transform your mindset into, this is a learnable set of skills. I'm not broken because it wasn't taught to me. It's just something that I need to get out and begin to try and understand, and to find the best way to do that, to find somebody who has done it and let them teach me how to do it as quickly and at as low a cost as is reasonable. So that's part one of this transformed mindset. And part two is to stop focusing on managing your time and start focusing on managing your attention and deploying your attention in the right ways. I've argued elsewhere, time is not something we can manage. Time is something that happens to us. It goes by as it goes by. Sometimes it feels like it goes by faster, and sometimes it feels like it goes by slower, but we're very seldom in control of that. The transformed mindset is part A and part B. Part A is start thinking like a professional athlete thinks. Start thinking like somebody who's serious about what they do, and go find somebody that can help you. Get out of the do-it-yourself mindset. I would argue that this is one of those problems where you need to bring a professional in rather than trying to do it yourself. And part B is to stop focusing on managing your time and start really thinking about what's going on with your attention and how can you best apply your attention in any situation. And that'll be a more fruitful line of discussion and coaching for you, in my experience with my clients. So we've talked about the problem. Nobody teaches this stuff. We've talked about some symptoms. For example, this nagging sense of there's got to be a better way. Well, there is. We've talked about the transformed mindset of really moving into thinking of yourself as a professional knowledge worker, and thus needing the kinds of help that professionals typically reach out for. What would be some results of this transformed mindset? Well, I thought a lot about this, and I've talked to a lot of my clients about, what did you actually feel? What actually happened to you? How did your perspective change after you understood this material and started practicing it? And they've said several things, and I've summarized them here. So the results that you can expect if you change your mindset in these ways is you wind up with a tool set that works for you rather than against you. You wind up adopting a set of practices and principles that actually help you, that move you towards your results, rather than are constantly frustrating you in the long term. The tips and tricks are the training equivalent of eating candy when you're hungry, right? It kind of feels good. It kind of makes sense at the time. That's the thing. But in the long term, it really doesn't help you achieve your goal. So cobbling together tips and tricks really is working against you, because you're constantly questioning how that fits together. So one of the results you'll see is that in the long term, and again, if you're working with me on Attention Compass, most people begin to feel it after 3 or 4 weeks of conversation. And when I say feel it, what I mean is they begin to, the light bulb goes off and they begin to understand, oh, I see how these things work together and produce in me results that I want, rather than some alternative misfit feeling all the time. Result one, your tool set works for you rather than against you. Result two is you stop wasting time looking for things in your work and planning poorly. That's the result that we're looking for, is better productivity. Well, the easiest way to get better productivity is to eliminate waste. And when we're talking about our attention, the waste of our attention is to be constantly looking for things, to be constantly making plans that aren't well thought out. So that's how time is wasted with our attention. Another time waster for attention is these distractions that pop up. Okay, so find somebody that can help you learn an effective mechanism for dealing with the distractions. That means you'll stop wasting time. That means that you'll be more productive. The third result that you'll see is you begin to feel calm and confident about your work and about the system. as compared to constantly feeling, oh, it's not, it doesn't fit, it doesn't feel right. Somebody that can help you move through the steps in some order so that each one feels like you're making progress. But the result that you're looking for is you feel calm and confident about your work because you're actually managing it rather than letting it manage you. Many people that come to me are in this position where they're not managing their email. Their email's managing them. Their email pops up and they, oh, well, I have to deal with that email. Okay. That's not managing a system. That's letting a system manage it. And that always feels frantic and stressful when we're letting a system manage us. So that's the third result. You feel calm and confident about your work. The fourth result is if you find the right areas to work, then you'll be able to stick with it long enough to build habits. So you'll get progressive small wins that encourage you to stay on the path rather than some collection of weirdness that you constantly have to tinker with. So able to stick with it long enough to build habits. And that's what we're trying to do. A great tennis player, their swing pattern is a habit, and they could hardly do it the wrong way if they tried. And so those habits are very important to us, but you have to stick with a system long enough to let your brain reorient and build those habits. Result number 5 is once you've built habits, then and only then are you in a position to add tweaks and incorporate other tools, other tactics, other thinking patterns into it. If you want to get inventive on the ski slopes and do a triple reverse flip, you can really only do that if you're already quite a competent skier. But quite a competent skier is the basics. Are your skis pointed in the right direction? Are your bindings in good shape? Are the poles working for you or against you? Can you manage your speed appropriately? All of these kinds of things build up into the triple backflip that we see on the X Games. But if we try the triple backflip first, even if we're successful, we're going to build habits that are not long-term supportable tactics and mindsets that help us. Build the foundation first. Build this level of consistent ability to do the, I'll say, relatively mundane acts of knowledge work. And then you can build on top of that. But if you try and build on top of that first, then you'll find that your foundation is not well set and will cause you problems later. So those are some results you can look for as you change this mindset. At this point, towards the end, we typically talk a little bit about tools that you might utilize and will make sense to you once your mindset is transformed around this lie. One of the tools is you'll have a place to keep your backlog of tasks and ideas. And if you haven't heard of the notion of a backlog and how it applies to the problem of productivity, I would say that's one of these foundational tactics or techniques that you need to put in place. So backlog management, but one of the tools that you'll have is you'll have a tool that allows you to store your backlog. Things don't get lost. It's not a stack of paper, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. The second part of the tool set is that a good tool, and at this point, I'm now talking about most likely a computer system to help you do this. The tool, the system has features that help you then manage and maintain that backlog so that it doesn't get jumbled and messy and turn into a mishmash of things where you can't find your own ideas and thoughts. Summarize. The lie in this case is a lie of omission, and nobody's talking about the ways in which you manage yourself and your knowledge work. We talked about several different components of the problem. Knowledge work is a fairly new phenomenon, and people really don't understand how it works as compared to like physical labor. We talked about the fact that you have a human brain. Yours is not all that terribly unique. You are a terribly unique individual, but your brain itself is not all that terribly unique. And there are certain principles that underlie what's going on. We don't talk about this, but we could, and that's the problem. Symptoms, again, the primary symptom is this nagging sense of there's got to be a better way. It's this consistent level of stress around our work. Even heart surgeons wind up, after several years of practice, wind up being comfortable with what they're doing, and they could kill somebody. So if we're not over time getting rid of this nagging sense, and people give it different names, imposter syndrome, people deal with it in different ways, they multitask. These are symptoms. And so we need to recognize them as symptoms and get a treatment that helps them go away. The transformed mindset that we want to talk about is become a pro. Think of yourself as a budding world-class athlete. In athletics, we know that there's this underlying set of things we need to do that generally fall under athleticism. We need to work on these things. The same thing is true for pro knowledge workers, is we need to get the basics dealt with so that we can be in the right place at the right time to apply our knowledge. Results, I talk about this calm, peaceful productivity, this sense of I've been here before, I've dealt with a similar situation, I do these steps and everything will most likely turn out okay. And that peace is really, that calmness is really kind of hard to explain. I've got some of my clients that talk on video, and you can begin to see those as we'll release them fairly soon, and they'll explain it to you in their own words, and perhaps that'll help. Finally, we talked about tools. The tools don't have to be esoteric. They don't have to have a ton of features. They don't have to be expensive. Fairly simple tool sets can work here. And in my coaching around Attention Compass, I've centered in on what I think is the best tool. And I can explain that to you if you come to me for coaching, or if you buy some of the products that are available to help you learn this information. So we've hopefully exposed another lie about productivity. I hope you're walking away from this understanding that it's not some failing that you don't understand how to manage your own productivity as a knowledge worker. It's not. We don't have the educational pieces in place to recognize that there's a problem and to provide solutions for problems. And thus, we're all facing a problem that we're each of us solving this problem independently over and over again. And that's horribly inefficient. So I'd like for you to move away from that. This is Larry Tribble, Ph.D. Thanks for taking some time to improve your task and information management on the Do Busy Right podcast. The show is dedicated to helping you think about how to get better at working. And we do this by improving your attention and your focus. I believe that your work is not just about your job, but about all the tasks that you do to turn yourself, your environment, and your relationships into what you want them to be. What we're really talking about here is the underpinnings of becoming who you want to be. The primary way I help people is through coaching the Attention Compass process. Attention Compass is 4 workflows and a tool set that support our information, task, and attention management. I help people with big goals to build habits that put them in a position to achieve. We do this by eliminating wasted time and wasted attention. If you'd like to know more, you can find me on LinkedIn or go to dobusyright.com for more information. Have a good week, more effective and less exhausted. Do Busy Right.